Finally, to the last bit of A&P1, where we're going to be discussing joints. We're going to have two videos for you. One is going to be about the different types of joints and classification of joints, as well as what certain types of joints allow different types of movements, both of which are going to be pretty important for you later on. Let's begin with discussing what is a joint. A joint is, well, there's a lot of definitions in our world that's considered a joint, but the joints that we care about are the ones that allow bone-to-bone interaction, or the one that has a cartilage and bone, or teeth and bone. It's not an actual combination of these materials, but because of the way that they're formed or shaped, they aren't actual direct fused bones. We can classify these types of bones into structural and functional. Structural, the really easiest way to say that is, what's it made of? Functional is, what can it do? Structurally, you got fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial. Fibrous and cartilaginous should be pretty straightforward what they're made of. Fibrous, well, it's made of fibers. You got sutures in your skull, syndesmosis, which is an example of it would be a gomphosis, which is your tooth in your mouth. And then there's an interosseous membrane. Cartilaginous, take a stab in the dark what that's made of. Cartilaginous, cartilage. It's made of cartilage. You got two types, the synchondrosis, symphysis, and then finally something is synovial. This is the one that everyone thinks about when you think, oh, my joints are hurting, or oh, I can move my joints, but they're a wee bit sore. Okay, this sounds like an old person talking. Might be me, who knows. But it's the ones that everyone thinks move. Well, it's made of a liquid called synovial fluid, which we will be discussing here in a little while. We can talk about the joints in a functional sense as well. Synarthrosis, amphiarthrosis, and diarthrosis. Synarthrosis just means joint. So when somebody says they have arthritis or things like that, they're talking about the joints hurting, or the joints are inflamed. Syn means little to or no, without. So this is saying there is no movement. Amphi, maybe you remember your friends, the amphibians, that have two stages. Amphiarthrosis means there's a little bit of movement. Like there's one or maybe two different types of movements. Not much though, but there is some. And diarthrosis, maybe you can think of a term that starts off with dia. The one I can think of is when I was a wee little child, when it has a nice catchy song to it. It goes, when you're running into first and you feel something, burst, diarrhea. Diarrhea flows quite nicely. And diarthrotic joints, well, they're free moving. It's like, well, diarrhea. So let's go into detail about the structural joint of fibrous joints. We're going to be applying them and the functional joints as we come across them, but you're pretty much guaranteed that fibrous joints aren't going to move very much, or if at all. We got three different types, the sutures, syndesmoses, as well as the interosseous membranes. Let's go ahead and look at the sutures. We looked at the skull recently. We named, oh, this bone is the frontal, this one is the parietal, this is temporal. But in between each one of them, you saw these little lines. These are sutures. And this is a type of joint. When you're a child, when you're an infant, it's not so fibrous. But as an adult, it's become well sealed together. They're structural ligaments. Ligaments are fibrous material like the connective tissue, like dense regular connective tissue. If you remember all the fibers running in one specific direction and they're really strong, yeah, that's what's going on in a sutural ligament. It's not going to really let your bones move. You also got the syndesmosis. So we got, for instance, it's just, if I were to explain it a little bit differently, it's just maybe the length of it's changed a little bit, or the structure just a tiny bit has changed a little bit as well. So for instance, at the distal end of the tibia and the fibula, you're going to find this anterior tibiofibular ligament. That's an example of a syndesmosis. It's a very fibrous tissue that doesn't really allow the movement of these tibia and fibula from each other, thankfully. Another example of a syndesmosis is this gomphosis, which is just the only example we have inside our bodies is the tooth in the socket. You got a bunch of alveolar processes that connect the tooth to that bone. Finally, the last type of fibrous joint is the interosseous membranes. You have one in between your tibia and fibula. It's this giant thing that's spanning the entire thing. It's again a ligament. It's a fibrous connective tissue that is just not going to let it move. So all of these were pretty much maybe, just maybe amphiarthrotic. Cartilaginous joints, remember that they are made of cartilage, another type of connective tissue. We got two different types. We got the synchondrosis and the symphysis. The synchondrosis, only one of the few examples that we have in our body, is the one between the first rib and the manubrium of the sternum. The symphysis is found in a couple of different places. In one particular location, you got a pubic symphysis going on right here, which can be a little bit more pliable, can be amphi, especially if there's a rush of oxytocin in females. Makes sense that this would become more pliable when oxytocin is released. Oxytocin is the hormone of birth. You would want to be able to expand that pelvic outlet for the birthing process to occur. There is one other one that's disputed whether or not it's called a joint, but you can't really call it a joint at the same time. But we're going to run with it anyways. The epiphyseal plate, if you remember, in children, is cartilaginous. So it's connecting bone to bone, even though it's the same bone. But it's also, it's a functionally synarthrotic joint. Synovial joints, what's neat about them, yes, they are free-flowing. How that happens, where two joints come together, they will make it, and you want it to move, like for instance this finger. We got an it'll form an articular capsule, and inside that capsule you're going to have a nice liquidy center filled with synovial fluid. Synovial fluid is there to help cushion, it's helped to nourish, it's there to keep that joint happy. It's produced by this synovial membrane, which is right there. And then that synovial membrane and that synovial fluid is contained again into a fibrous membrane. You kind of can see the difference between the two quite nicely here. You'll see that the lighter pink here is that fibrous membrane, while they're indicating here that that synovial membrane is more on the inside, so it's indicative that there's that capsule right there. One last thing I should point out about a joint is that this synovial fluid can act as shock absorption as well. In part because each time you get a lot of pressure, that fluid can creep into this articular cartilage. So that articular cartilage is acting like a sponge during that shock to help slow down the debuckling or the approach of these two bones together. So a nice little shock absorber. Lots of different types of bones, lots of different types of joints throughout your entire body. One thing I should point out about synovial joints, the diarthrotic joints, is that the more free-moving they are, the more likely they are it can become unstable. The ones that you probably think of the most, or most people think of the most, I should say, is your shoulder, which is indeed the most free-moving. You can rotate it in so many different ways, stick it out, pull it back in. It's amazing. If they're the more free-moving, meaning usually it's because there's not as much bone to keep it in place. It relies a lot more on these ligaments. Ligaments, again, is that a connective tissue, that dense fibrous connective tissue connecting bone to bone. You can have extracapsular ligaments that you see here, or intracapsular ligaments like you see here that's coming off of that process on the head of the femur, that fovea capitis, and inserting into the acetibulum. So if I were to summarize how to stabilize a joint, you got ligaments, you got the bone markings to help it there, as well as one last thing we haven't discussed is muscle. Muscle does a pretty good job at keeping things stable. You're constantly having specific muscles tone while you're standing, sitting, laying, all that stuff to help maintain those joints in the right places. Now, we do have a lot of moving parts, and because we have a lot of moving parts, there can be a lot of rubbing and a lot of soreness and a lot of not happiness. How we avoid that is we add little, what I would say, ball bearings almost to the mix. And these are via these, I just marked right here is a bursa and a tendon sheath. Bursas are little pockets of liquid. Little pockets of liquid that's either in between bone and bone to help, again, with that shock absorption. Maybe it's between bone and muscle to help avoid rubbing, and which is fantastic because if it keeps rubbing and rubbing, you're going to damage tissue. And if you damage ligaments and it becomes weak, you're going to destabilize a joint, and it's not going to be a happy place to be. You can also have these tendon sheaths. You'll notice that this is the head of the biceps brachii. And remember that it has this sulcus here in this bone. Well, each time you contract that biceps, it's very possible that you're going to be tugging and moving. You're going to be tugging and moving on that muscle, and it's going to rub against this bone. And eventually, if there was no protection for it, it would rub raw and then eventually rip. Fortunately, you have something called a tendon sheath, which is basically a bursa, but it's wrapped around like a tube around a tendon, filled with liquid to help with the slipping past. Just like an oil in the car acts as like a lubrication for your strong metals that usually would be rubbing together without them, which is a very bad way to destroy a car. You'll never get it back, or at least get a new engine out of it. But yeah, add oil, it runs well, you'll be good to go. I just feel like I was a car salesman right there. With that is the end of the description between the difference of functional and structural, as well as a definition of the synovial. We will go ahead in the next video discuss the different types of movements that these synovial joints, these synovial or diarthrotic joints allow for you to go through.